Hello and a warm welcome to the show. This is Pulse of Culture and I'm Sally Jastrzębska. Our guest today is the British mathematician Adam Kucharski. He's a professor at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. His research centers on how data can help us get ready for pandemics. Adam's latest book, Proof the Uncertain Science of Certainty, looks at how AI, social media and political divides are reshaping how we think about evidence and what we trust. Hello, sir. Delighted to have you with us. Thank you for joining.
Thank you.
So I pronounced your name the Polish way, as I wanted to start by asking you about your Polish roots.
Yes, so my grandfather was Polish, but he moved to the UK many years ago and died a few decades ago. So unfortunately, I don't speak as much Polish as I'd like.
But it's great to have you here. So I'm going to show you a picture that went viral some time ago. It is a vehicle, allegedly a Tesla designed by Nikola Tesla himself, obviously a fake. How dangerous are things like this? Because it's still got millions of views, thousands of likes. So isn't it potentially problematic?
Yeah, and I think we're going to see more and more of these kind of situations. So there's been some really useful research over the years looking at why people share things that are false. And if you ask people, do you want to share things that are accurate online? Most people will say that they do. But often in the moment, other things can override that desire to say things that are true. For example, if things have an emotional response, perhaps it's amazement or anger, or if things are new, people might see something and want to share it with others because they think it's interesting or it's useful or it's important. And often when you look at people's behavior, that can override what might be an ability to tell whether something's accurate. And really with the rise of AI, it's becoming much easier to come up with these things that are new and surprising. And I think one risk, of course, is that people will fall for more things that are false. But I think also the danger is people will start to doubt a lot of other things that are true. I think already we see that a lot of the images you come across online, you might just doubt and wonder if it's AI. So I think those are the two risks that we're going to have to manage in future.
So actually, I have a soundbite from your TED Talk some time ago, and I wanted to take a listen to this one.
The idea of heart defibrillation has been around since 1899, but researchers are still working to untangle the biology and physics that means an electric shock can reset a heart. Then there's general anesthesia. We know what combination of drugs will make a patient unconscious, but it's still not entirely clear exactly why they do.
So these things are true. However, they're difficult to explain, right, to an average person. So my question is, how do we discern between fact and fiction?
I think that's a really good question. And there's lots of things in life where we can build enough understanding about it to be useful for our purposes. So, for example, something like heart defibrillation or anesthesia, with enough evidence over time as it's used, we can get a good understanding of if you use that tool, this is the effect you're likely to see, even if there's still questions about the underlying biology. I think where that becomes much harder is where that desire for explanation is much deeper. So, for example, a lot of uses of AI, people are mistrustful, even if self-driving cars are much better than humans, and human drivers often aren't that good. There's still going to be that doubt because we don't understand the decision-making process behind that. So I think it's really important to think about the level of evidence we need for something to be useful and the situations where that breaks down. It might be that we have a treatment for a disease that's really effective and we can do the studies to show that it helps people even without understanding it. In other situations, particularly where we're putting tools like AI into societies and decision-making processes, it's going to be much more important to give people some understanding and some explanation about what's actually going on rather than just looking at the effects that it has.
Right, so there has to be a level of trust in the data. But what about conspiracy theorists? I mean, sometimes they do have robust evidence, right?
I think conspiracy theories are a really interesting one. I think people often put a lot of effort into these kinds of beliefs. If you talk to people, they'll have a lot of scientific data, a lot of research papers, perhaps. And often there'll be some logical flaw in how they've interpreted it. They might have missed a key point, or it might be taking something out of context. But I think you can't go into those debates assuming that you're very quickly just going to say everything that they're showing is false. That often it's much harder to find that particular flaw, which eventually will kind of cause everything to collapse. But I think what is important is to remember what we're trying to do when we think about truth and science, and we're not just trying to show how clever we are or how good we are at going against consensus and going against authority. If we want to get closer to truth, the evidence will sometimes show that we're wrong. We might have a theory and it will be overturned. And that's a really important part of the process, which I think often breaks down when we're talking about conspiracy theories, because it is much more about the performance of showing that you're thinking for yourself and you're challenging authority rather than actually getting closer to the reality. One thing I found really striking with the book is even just the political relationship with science. So we sometimes think now of mistrust of science as certain political groups that being more dominant. But if you look in the US, for example, in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, mistrusting scientific institutions was much more of a position on the left wing, because that was the kind of relationship with authority at the time. And then over subsequent decades into the modern era, it's become much more of a right-wing position. So it's not enough just to say there's certain individuals that are better and worse at science. We need to look at that relationship between institutions and the sort of conspiracies you might have had in the 60s, which perhaps would have thought that there's a powerful government and interactions around institutions, perhaps hiding information, and where we are in the modern era. It's really about trust and relationships with authority, and there's much wider aspects of life rather than just one specific theory or study.
Absolutely. So let's turn to epidemics, because I believe that's your area of expertise. And again, I have a soundbite prepared, so let's listen to this one from Bill Gates.
If anything kills over 10 million people in the next few decades, it's most likely to be a highly infectious virus.
So it is his famous talk from 2015, and indeed, COVID-19 pandemic happened a few years later. So my question is, can maths predict future outbreaks perhaps, and can we use it to prepare ourselves better?
I think maths can be extremely useful for understanding contagious threats. I think even just the nature of something that spreads with one person generating more infection, and then that infection generating infection and building and growing faster and faster, is something that can be quite counterintuitive. I think we saw that during COVID. We see that in lots of epidemics where people think, oh, it's fine, it's at quite low levels and it's maybe slightly larger, and then suddenly you've got this enormous problem. And really that's just the underlying mathematics that's driving that. And if we don't appreciate that, we can often underprepare. We perhaps act too late. We perhaps don't have enough resources for how we're responding. So I think really moving into that way of thinking much more about these exponential threats. And it's not just disease epidemics. We see that with things like viral inflammation as well, that things can suddenly take off out of nowhere. And it seems to have just been this remarkably fast process, but actually there's an underlying explanation for it. And I think mathematics can really help us essentially look at the underlying rules and the underlying processes and then adjust our response.
COVID-19 is also a good case study showing how people responded, right, to what was happening and also to vaccines. Some of them were saying, of course, that they're not working, that perhaps they're poison or whatnot. So do you think that their approach has changed? And why are people so prone to believe in things like that?
I think COVID was, on the one hand, an example of science really helping us. I mean, the damage that would have occurred if vaccines hadn't arrived would have been so much greater. I mean, really, it was science that allowed societies to open much earlier and have those freedoms without having all the death and disease with it. But as you said, there's also that skepticism. And I think partly just the timescales involved, that when we are seeing evidence emerge much faster, there's much more uncertainty. I think people are used to science and health perhaps developing over many decades, and actually having something emerge much faster and having to communicate the evidence and these new technologies that is a challenge because it is more for people to become familiar with on a much shorter timescale. I think also it relates to these relationships with authority. I think depending on different countries and different groups in society, their relationship with health systems, their relationship with government, I think influenced a lot of their reaction to the different control measures that were being in place, the different tools like vaccines. Countries like the UK, for example, because I think people have a lot of interaction with this National Health Service, got very high engagement in that vaccine program. Other countries where things, like the US, are more fragmented, there was a lot more variation in that level of engagement with vaccines. So I think it's not just about the technology and the science, it's actually just about how society interacts with these things more generally. I think COVID, because it was such an extreme event on such an extreme timescale, really amplified a lot of these feelings.
Mm-hmm. So how do we sort of fight potential disinformation online regarding, let's say, vaccines? Do we use more facts? What needs to be done in order to really engage people? Because, I mean, there's a risk, right, that they'll just, step away altogether, that they won't even be interested in our explanation.
I think that's a really important question. And it's really important to understand why people are thinking that way about things. And there's been some nice emerging evidence looking at what works and what doesn't. So, for example, being very overconfident. If we say, this is definitely the truth and science is completely sure of this, that can actually backfire, because if there is uncertainty, that can reduce people's confidence in things. What can be more useful is allowing people to understand that weight of evidence and uncertainty. In some cases, using humor if there is misinformation. In other cases, thinking about how we preempt potentially harmful information. I mean, even if you think about an infectious disease in the population, one option is we just wait for it to appear and then try and chase it down and stop it. Another option, which we use commonly, is vaccines or building up immunity, because what that allows us to do is not have to react really quickly. We can actually reduce people's susceptibility to that in the first place. So that, again, is quite a promising avenue, I think.
And Adam, since you're a mathematician, let me ask you about algorithms. I came across a book pretty famous back then, Algorithms to Live By, which, of course, gives us different examples where we can use maths to make better choices. So do you agree with that theory, that perhaps we could choose a life partner or our house based on certain data that is out there?
I think there's a lot of value in data. I think there's always a danger of perhaps being too overconfident or too algorithmic, because a lot of life does have that level of uncertainty. But I think particularly one of the things that stood out while researching my book is the importance of thinking about how we want to manage that risk. Even if you look at something like a life partner, there's one risk that you'll get heartbroken, for example, and one way to manage that risk is just never fall in love. But for most people, that's not a very good solution. So we accept that risk for the benefits of having that trust and having that relationship. And it's similar whether you look at things like legal cases or you look at things like medical trials. We have a risk in some cases of, say, a legal case, convicting someone who's innocent. We also have a risk of letting someone who's guilty go free. And so we have to balance these risks. We don't want to set the bar for evidence too high, because then we'll miss a lot of individuals who were guilty. But we don't want to set it too low, because then a lot of people potentially will go free. So it's similar, with medical experiments, that we need to decide, do we have a very high threshold or a very low threshold for evidence, and how do we weigh these risks, and how do we build confidence to live our lives in a useful way, but also making use of the available data in terms of managing that potential for error.
Right, so in case someone needs help, they have your new book, Proof the Uncertain Science of Certainty. We highly recommend that. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching Pulse of Culture. Please stay tuned for more here on TVP World.